Millennia carries scarlet rot inside her own body, rather than simply wielding it as a weapon. Moog binds his own blood to Maquella's flesh, rather than simply keeping Maquella captive by conventional means. There's a recurring pattern in Elden Ring's demigods of choosing to merge with the source of their power, rather than control it from a safe distance. Why that pattern exists, whether it reflects something about how power actually functions in this world, some rule the game never states outright that says godhood requires physical merger rather than mere possession, is itself an unsolved thread running underneath most of what we're going to cover in the rest of this script. It's worth wondering whether the demigods who chose merger over control understood something about the nature of the Elden Ring itself that the player never gets access to directly. Some cosmic principle that says power in this world cannot simply be held. It must be worn, absorbed, made part of your body in a way that erases the boundary between the wielder and the wielded. If that's true, then Rykard's transformation isn't an aberration born of one demigod's specific madness. It's the logical endpoint of how power works in the lands between, applied by someone willing to go further than his siblings, someone who looked at the rule everyone else was following partially and decided to follow it completely. We'll come back to this pattern later, because it resurfaces in a much stranger form when we get to Radagon and Marika near the end of this script. But for now, let's leave Volcano Manor behind and head somewhere colder. There's a bridge in East Altus, leading toward a divine tower, guarded by two figures the game gives almost no direct explanation for. And the theory the community has settled on regarding their identity might be even more disturbing than confirmation would have been. The Fell twins stand on that bridge, waiting. One has had its horns excised. The other carries an unmistakable curse. And the moment you first see them, most experienced players report the exact same reaction. A jolt of recognition, because they look remarkably, unmistakably, like two demigods you've already killed. Are the Fell twins actually Morgott and Moog, somehow restored, somehow duplicated, standing guard on a bridge you'll need to cross to reach a divine tower most players never even knew existed until they stumbled onto it by accident? The game never says. It never confirms, and it never denies. What it gives you instead is a pattern of visual and thematic parallels precise enough that the theory has become close to consensus among lore researchers, even without a single line of text anywhere confirming it outright. Let's look at what we actually know. The Fell twins are omens, like Morgott and Moog. They are twins, like Morgott and Moog. They guard a bridge that leads directly to a divine tower, the exact kind of structure Morgott spent his entire life protecting in Lindell. One twin wields a warped axe coated in bloodflame. If that phrase sounds familiar, it should, because bloodflame is the exact power associated with Mog, Lord of Blood, the demigod who fled Lindell to found his own bloody dynasty in the depths beneath the capital. The other twin is heavily accursed and wields an omen cleaver, capable of summoning wraiths, evoking Morgott's own cursed nature as the self-proclaimed last of all kings. The demigod who never left Lindell, who stayed and defended a city that never once thanked him for it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the location of this encounter and notice that it isn't random. The bridge leads to the Divine Tower of East Altus, and interacting with it during the fight actually activates both Morgo's and Moog's great runes simultaneously, a mechanical detail that exists nowhere else in the game. Why would a random pair of unnamed omens activate the great runes of two specific named demigods, unless there's some deeper connection between them? The game's own systems seem to be nudging players toward the theory, even as the narrative text stays completely silent about it. It's worth wondering whether the developers intended this specifically as a puzzle for the community to solve, without ever confirming the answer. A deliberate gap left open because the ambiguity itself is more thematically resonant than a straightforward confirmation would have been. If the Fell twins are echoes, illusions, or fragments of Morgott and Mog, cast off during the War of the Shattering, or created afterward by some force the game never names, then what we're fighting on that bridge isn't a new enemy at all. It's a memory given weight and blades, standing guard over a tower that the real Morgott and Moog either couldn't or wouldn't protect themselves. But there's a competing reading worth taking seriously. One favored by players who find the direct echo theory a little too tidy for a game this deliberately vague. Some argue the Fell twins are simply what they appear to be, two more omens, cursed the same way Morgott and Moog were cursed, exiled the same way, armed with similar power because omens as a category share similar afflictions, not because these two specific figures are secretly royalty. Under this reading, the parallels aren't evidence of a hidden identity. They're evidence of a shared condition. Omens across the lands between might simply gravitate towards similar weapons and similar curses, because that's what being an omen does to a person, regardless of whether you happen to be born into a line of kings or into total obscurity. This version of the theory is, in its own way, more disturbing than the alternative. If the Fell twins are just two more omens, cursed and discarded the way all omens are cursed and discarded, guarding a tower nobody remembers exists, then Morgott and Mohg were never special cases. They were simply the two omens who happened to be born close enough to power to matter. Somewhere beneath Lindell, in the subterranean shunning grounds, there could be dozens more like them. Omens with no names the story ever gives us, living and dying in total obscurity, cursed the exact same way, with none of the narrative weight or tragic backstory the game affords its named demigods. The Fell twins, under this reading, aren't ghosts of Morgott and Mohg. They're a glimpse of what Morgott and Mohg's lives would have looked like if they hadn't been born to Marika and Godfrey, a reminder that the tragedy the game spends so much time mourning for its named characters is happening constantly, anonymously, to people the story never bothers to name. Neither theory has been confirmed. Both remain entirely community-driven interpretation built from visual parallels and one shared mechanical trigger, and From Software, true to form, has never weighed in on which reading, if either, was the intended one. It's worth noting that this kind of deliberate ambiguity shows up constantly throughout Elden Ring's design. Optional bosses placed in obscure locations with just enough connective tissue to suggest a theory without ever confirming it, almost as though the developers are more interested in giving the community raw material than finished answers. That's an editorial choice worth naming directly, because this script and the ones before it in this catalog tend to favor presenting multiple competing theories rather than picking a single favorite and asserting it as fact, precisely because the source material itself so rarely provides a clean, singular answer to work from. So we're going to leave the Fell twins exactly where the game leaves them, unresolved, guarding a bridge to a tower most players never find, wearing the faces of demigods they may or may not actually be. Let's cross into darker territory next, because there's another recurring enemy in Elden Ring, whose entire existence raises a question nobody, including the game itself, seems fully willing to answer. Why do they keep fighting, centuries after the war that supposedly gave their deaths meaning has already ended? The enemies in question are the soldiers you find scattered across nearly every major ruin in the lands between, the ones still wearing the crests of houses that fell before the shattering even started, still holding formations, still following orders that nobody living gave them and nobody living remembers giving. They don't seem to know the war is over. Some of them may not be capable of knowing anything at all anymore, which raises a much darker possibility than simple confusion, the possibility that they were never given the choice to stop. Consider what actually happens to a soldier in the lands between when their body fails them. In most worlds, that's the end of the story. Here, death is closer to a suggestion than a conclusion, and the rune of death being missing from play for most of the game's internal history means that dying doesn't carry the finality it would carry anywhere else. Bodies keep moving. Wills keep fighting. Whatever it is that makes a person seems to linger long after the part of them that could object to lingering has gone quiet. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes nearly every skeleton, every rotted knight, every headless soldier still swinging a blade in the dark as something closer to a hostage situation than a monster encounter. The game asks you to fight through them as though they're obstacles, environmental hazards with weapons, and mechanically that's exactly what they are. But the implication sitting underneath that mechanical framing is considerably less comfortable, because it suggests these aren't monsters at all. They're what's left over when death itself is broken, still standing where their orders left them, still fighting a war that ended before some of them were even born into the second or third generation of soldiers who inherited it. It's worth wondering whether this is the single most quietly upsetting thing in Elden Ring's entire design. More upsetting in some ways than the game's more overt tragedies, precisely because it never announces itself as tragic. Millennia's rot is framed with music and cutscenes and dialogue that make sure you understand you're witnessing something sorrowful. The soldier standing guard over a bridge that's led to nowhere for 300 years gets none of that. He just gets a health bar and a weapon moveset, and you cut him down and move on. And the game never once stops to tell you that what you just did might have been a mercy killing rather than a fight. One theory, popular among players who read Elden Ring's environmental storytelling as fundamentally bleak, holds that this is precisely the point, that From Software wants you to feel the weight of that ambiguity retroactively, once you've already killed hundreds of these soldiers without a second thought, once the realization arrives too late to change how you engaged with the game the first time through. Under this reading, the horror isn't in any single encounter. It's in the accumulation. The fact that you've been doing this the entire time without knowing what you were doing, and the game trusts you to eventually figure it out on your own, probably well after the credits roll. A different reading pushes back against assigning this much intentional cruelty to the design, arguing instead that the undying soldiers exist primarily as world-building texture, a way of communicating the scale and duration of the War of the Shattering without requiring dialogue or cutscenes to do it. Under this version, the tragedy is real but incidental, a byproduct of building a world where death doesn't function normally, rather than a carefully engineered gut punch aimed at players after the fact. Both readings can coexist without contradicting each other, which is probably the most honest thing you can say about most of Elden Ring's darker implications. What makes this thread even harder to resolve cleanly is that some of these soldiers clearly retain fragments of awareness. Certain enemy dialogue lines, delivered in half-intelligible mutters as you approach, suggest confusion, fear, even a kind of exhausted resignation that reads as closer to a person than a construct. Compare that to the fully mindless husks found in some of the game's more corrupted zones, creatures that have lost every trace of the will that presumably once animated them. And you start to see something like a spectrum rather than a binary. Some undying soldiers are closer to ghosts, still tethered to a fragment of personhood. Others have been hollowed out completely, left as pure motion with nothing steering it anymore. If that spectrum is real, and it's never confirmed as a deliberate design axis so much as something players have pieced together by comparing enough enemies against each other, then killing an undying soldier isn't one consistent moral act repeated hundreds of times. It's a different act depending on where that particular soldier sits on the spectrum between person and husk. And the game gives you no reliable way to tell the difference before your weapon connects. You're never given the information you'd need to know whether you just ended someone's suffering or simply cleared an obstacle that stopped being a someone a long time ago. This ties back, in a strange roundabout way, to the pattern we started with at Volcano Manor. The demigods who chose to merge with their power rather than simply wield it. If merging with power erases the boundary between wielder and wielded, then perhaps something similar happens at a much smaller scale to ordinary soldiers who die without a working rune of death to release them properly. The boundary between the soldier and the compulsion that keeps him standing collapses. The same way the boundary between Millennia and her rot collapsed. The same way the boundary between Mohg and Miquella's flesh collapsed. Different scale, arguably the same underlying rule about a world where you cannot simply hold on to something, whether that something is power or a body or a purpose. Eventually it holds on to you instead. We don't know if that connection is intentional on From Software's part. It's the kind of thread that emerges more from the shape of the world than from any single piece of confirmed lore. The sort of pattern a careful player notices after enough hours logged and enough separate mysteries compared against each other, without ever getting a cutscene that says outright, yes, this is the rule. This is why it happens this way every time. That absence of confirmation is frustrating if you want answers. It's also, and this is worth saying plainly, probably the reason so many people are still making videos like this 1 year after the game released, because a world that explained itself completely wouldn't need this many strangers on the internet still arguing about what it meant. Let's follow that thread somewhere else entirely, because there's a location most players stumble past without realizing its full significance, a chamber deep beneath the lands between that seems to exist purely to raise questions the main story never circles back to answer. Beneath Angel River, past a lake of black water lit only by the faint bioluminescence of things that were never meant to be looked at directly, sits a ruined city called Noxtella, home of the Eternal City, and further down still, a corpse the size of a cathedral belonging to something called Astel, natural born of the void. Most players encounter Astel as a boss fight, a gauntlet of laser beams and gravity magic in a cavern that feels less like a location in a fantasy game, and more like a diagram of something the human mind isn't well equipped to parse. What almost nobody stops to ask, in the middle of dodging attacks that ignore normal physics, is what Astel actually is, and why an entity with that title is buried this far beneath a world it apparently isn't native to. The phrase natural born of the void does a lot of quiet work if you actually sit with it, instead of letting it wash past as flavor text. It implies birth, which implies a process, which implies that somewhere, something like reproduction or generation happened involving the void itself. The same void that in this game's cosmology sits in explicit opposition to the greater will and the golden order it established. Astel isn't described as an intruder from the void. It's described as born from it, native to it, which suggests the void isn't simply an absence waiting outside reality for something to invite it in. It's productive. It generates things. And at least one of those things ended up buried beneath the lands between long enough to build an entire dead civilization around itself. That civilization, Noxtella, gives us our first real clue that something has gone catastrophically wrong down here that predates anything involving Godfrey, Marika, or the Golden Order at all. The Knight's cavalry enemies scattered throughout the world, the ones who ride out only after dark and vanish into portals when defeated, are explicitly tied to this eternal city and to the death of its patron deity, a moon-aligned entity whose passing seems to have unraveled something the Nokron civilization depended on to survive. The Knight cavalry rides in mourning, over and over, an eternal patrol for a queen or a god that isn't coming back, in a city that fell so long ago its own inhabitants don't seem to fully remember why. One popular theory holds that the Eternal City predates the Erdtree entirely, that Nokron and Noxtella represent a civilization that existed under a different cosmic arrangement, worshipping different outer gods, before Marika's ascension and the establishment of the Golden Order reorganized the metaphysics of the entire world around her. Under this reading, what we're walking through when we explore these ruins isn't simply an older ruin the way Stormveil is an older ruin relative to Lindell. It's a fossil record of an entirely different cosmological regime, one that got quietly buried, literally and narratively, when Marika's order took over and rewrote the rules of what counted as sacred. If that's true, it raises an uncomfortable question about how many cosmological regimes the Lands Between has cycled through before the one players actually experienced during the game's runtime. The Golden Order presents itself as though it's simply how things are, an eternal, unquestionable arrangement of gods and grace and Erdtree light. But if Noxtella sits beneath it as a buried predecessor, then the Golden Order isn't the natural state of this world. It's one layer in a stack of them, and there's no particular reason to assume it's the final layer either, or that some future excavation and some future version of this world's history wouldn't uncover the current Golden Order the same way the current order uncovered Noxtella. Astel, then, isn't necessarily an invader in the way most video game final area bosses are invaders. It might be older than the concept of invasion even applies to, a native inhabitant of whatever the void actually is, sitting at the bottom of a civilization that worships something in the sky before anyone in the Lands Between had heard the word Erdtree. The player kills it as an obstacle on the way to another destination, the same casual violence applied to the undying soldiers we just spent so long discussing, except here the scale is cosmic rather than personal. And the implications ripple outward into questions about the entire structure of reality rather than the fate of one soldier's fading will. A competing and more skeptical reading resists stacking quite this much cosmological weight onto what is, after all, one boss fight in a cavern. This reading points out that From Software has a long history, stretching back through Dark Souls and Bloodborne, of using cosmic horror imagery primarily for atmosphere and aesthetic effect, rather than as a rigorously worked-out metaphysical system meant to be reverse-engineered piece by piece. Under this view, Astel is meant to feel ancient, alien, and vast, and the specific mechanics of what natural-born of the void technically means in some underlying cosmic taxonomy may simply not exist as a fully worked-out answer, even in the minds of the people who wrote it. Sometimes a phrase is chosen because it sounds right, not because it's the tip of an iceberg with a complete answer waiting underneath. Both readings have defenders, and the disagreement between them says something interesting about how differently people want to engage with this kind of world. Some players want every strange phrase to be a locked door with a key somewhere else in the game, a puzzle piece that clicks into a total picture if you just find enough of the other pieces. Other players are comfortable treating the strangeness as the point in itself, atmosphere rather than code, mood rather than mechanism. Elden Ring, frustratingly and probably deliberately, gives you enough evidence to support either position without ever fully closing the door on the other one. What we can say with more confidence is that the Eternal City's death, whatever caused it, happened long enough ago that its own guardians have become confused about their purpose, patrolling at night for a threat or a mourning ritual that long since lost its original context. That's a pattern we're going to see again and again throughout the rest of this script. Guardians outliving the thing they were meant to guard, purpose outliving meaning, structure outliving the reason the structure was built in the first place. The Lands Between is, in a very real sense, a world made almost entirely of load-bearing grief, held up by people and things that never got the memo that what they were protecting is already gone. Let's climb back up out of the depths and head toward the mountaintops of the giants, because there's a frozen conversation happening up there between two corpses that might be the single most quietly devastating scene in the entire game, and almost nobody who plays through it the first time realizes what they're actually looking at. The scene in question sits near a frozen lake at the edge of the mountaintops of the giants, where two corpses lie close enough together that most players assume, at a glance, they simply died in the same battle and happened to fall near each other. Look closer, and a much stranger detail emerges. One of the corpses belongs to a fire giant, one of the last of a race the game tells us almost nothing about directly. The other appears to be a smaller figure, and the positioning between them, arm outstretched, distance closed rather than left open, reads less like two combatants who happen to die in proximity, and more like two figures who died reaching for each other. The lore around the fire giants is thin by design, which is itself worth noting before digging into what little exists. We know they were numerous once. We know something reduced them to a scattered handful by the time the game's events take place. We know the last of them guards the Forge of the Giants at the mountain's peak, tending a flame that, if released, would burn the Erd Tree itself. A weapon of last resort kept ready by a dying race for a purpose the game never fully explains but strongly implies was meant to be used against Marika's order specifically, not simply as generic apocalyptic firepower. That detail alone reframes the fire giants from background dressing into something closer to a resistance movement. The last survivors of a people who apparently opposed the Golden Order strongly enough to maintain a weapon capable of destroying its most sacred object, for however many centuries it took the rest of their race to die out around them. That's not incidental world building. That's a political stance, maintained past the point where anyone remained alive to benefit from taking it, by someone who kept a promise long after everyone who could have released them from it was already dead. Which brings us back to the frozen scene by the lake. If the smaller corpse beside the fire giant is, as many players and lore researchers have concluded, a land octopus, one of the strange tentacled creatures found throughout the same region, then we're looking at what appears to be a friendship, or something adjacent to friendship, between two entities from radically different orders of being, ending in a shared death in the middle of nowhere, commemorated by absolutely nothing except item placement and body positioning that most players will never notice unless they're specifically looking for it. Nobody confirms this reading. There's no dialogue, no item description, no NPC who mentions it. It exists purely as an environmental detail, the kind of thing that could easily be coincidental corpse placement rather than an intentional narrative beat, and that ambiguity is precisely why it's so effective if it is intentional. The game isn't asking you to feel something about this scene. It's simply placing two bodies close together and letting you decide, entirely on your own, whether that closeness means anything at all. Most players walk past without a second glance. The ones who stop and look are rewarded with nothing except the private, unverifiable sense that they might have just witnessed the last moment of a friendship nobody else will ever know existed. This is worth connecting back to the undying soldiers we discussed earlier, and to the Eternal City's mourning guardians beneath Noxtella, because a pattern is starting to take shape across very different parts of this world. Grief in the Lands Between rarely gets a cutscene. It gets a corpse positioned a certain way, a patrol that never stops even though what it's protecting is gone. A curse maintained past the point where maintaining it still serves any purpose except habit and loyalty. From Software, across this game and its predecessors, consistently prefers to bury emotional weight in environmental arrangement rather than deliver it through dialogue, and Elden Ring may be the most extreme example of that instinct the studio has produced yet. A game willing to let its most affecting moments go completely unremarked if the player doesn't happen to look in the right direction at the right angle. There's a further wrinkle here worth considering, which is what it would mean for a fire giant, a being tied so specifically to opposition against the Golden Order, to have formed some kind of bond with a creature as seemingly insignificant as a land octopus. If the reading holds, it suggests something almost tender sitting underneath the apocalyptic weight of what the fire giants represent. A reminder that even a being guarding a weapon capable of burning down a god's tree was still apparently capable of forming an attachment to something small and strange, and probably not very useful to the larger cause. That tension between world-ending purpose and small private tenderness runs through more of this game's design than a first playthrough usually reveals. A more skeptical reading treats this entire theory as an example of pareidolia, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in essentially random or incidental arrangements, no different in kind from seeing a face in a cloud formation. Under this view, the corpses are simply placed where the region's difficulty design called for enemies to be fought, and any emotional narrative constructed around their positioning is entirely the player's own invention, projected backward onto details that carry no intended weight whatsoever. This reading isn't dismissive of the player's experience so much as cautious about attributing that experience to deliberate authorial intent without stronger evidence than corpse placement alone can provide. Both readings can be true simultaneously in the sense that matters most for how you experience the game. Whether or not From Software intended this specific emotional beat, the fact that so many players have independently arrived at the same interpretation without prompting from marketing or official statements says something real about how the environment is constructed, densely enough. Deliberately enough, that meaning keeps precipitating out of it, even in places nobody explicitly planted meaning to be found. That's either a testament to extraordinary intentional design, or a testament to how effectively suggestive imagery works on pattern-seeking minds, regardless of authorial intent. And there may not be a clean way to separate those two possibilities from inside the experience of playing the game. Let's head toward the Forge of the Giants itself now, and the Fire Giant boss fight. Because there's a detail in how that fight is staged that connects directly back to everything we've just discussed about grief, purpose, and things that outlive the reasons they were built. The detail is this. The Fire Giant fight takes place across a burned, ashen expanse, dotted with the remains of a funeral pyre the size of a small village, and the giant himself. Once you climb high enough onto his body to reach the actual weak point, turns out to be missing his legs entirely, propped upright by some combination of magic and sheer stubbornness, fighting a battle he has no realistic way of walking away from even in victory. He isn't defending the forge because he expects to survive doing it. He's defending it because he's the last one left who can, and the choice was made a long time before you ever arrived to end it for him. That detail, easy to miss in the chaos of actually fighting him, reframes the entire encounter the same way the frozen corpse scene reframes the surrounding region. This isn't a monster guarding treasure. It's the final member of a resistance movement, physically incapable of retreat, holding a position because holding it is the only thing left that gives his remaining existence any shape at all. Killing him doesn't feel like defeating an obstacle once you notice this. It feels like ending something that was already ending on its own, just slightly ahead of schedule. The same uncomfortable territory the Undying Soldiers put us in several threads ago. It's worth noting that once the Fire Giant falls and the flame at the Forge of the Giants is finally released into the Erd Tree, the game gives you almost no time to sit with what just happened before the story moves forward toward the mountaintop's true final confrontation. That pacing choice, whether intentional or simply a byproduct of level design priorities, means most players process the weight of the Fire Giant's death only in retrospect, if they process it at all, which fits neatly into the pattern we've been tracing across the last several threads of this script. The Lands Between rarely tells you to grieve. It simply moves on, and grieving becomes something you have to choose to do on your own time, well after the moment has technically passed. Let's shift focus now towards something that operates by almost the opposite logic. A character whose entire arc is built around choosing the timing of her own actions with total, almost unsettling precision, rather than being swept along by events the way so much of this world seems to be. Rainy the Witch, one of Mareka's own daughters, spends the majority of the game's runtime working toward an outcome that, once you actually complete her questline, turns out to be considerably stranger and more radical than most players expect walking in. Rani's plan, stripped down to its essential shape, involves severing her own connection to the Golden Order, embracing the Age of Stars, and effectively removing herself and her chosen faction from the entire mechanism of gods and grace and the Erd Tree's authority that governs everyone else in this world. To do this, she needed her own body destroyed. Replaced with the puppet vessel players find her inhabiting for most of the game, and needed her original physical form's death, staged in a way specific enough that it required the murder of Godwyn, her own half-brother, carried out by her loyal Blade and her advisor Iji, acting on her explicit instruction, years before the game's events begin. That's an enormous amount of premeditation to unpack, and the game reveals it to you gradually, in fragments through item descriptions and careful dialogue, rather than through any single scene that lays out the plan in full. Godwyn's death, one of the central catalytic events of the entire shattering, the thing that arguably set every other demigod against each other in the resulting war for the Elden Ring, wasn't an accident, wasn't an act of malice in any simple sense, and wasn't even primarily about Godwin himself. It was one component in a much larger, much colder piece of long-term planning by his own sister, aimed at achieving a goal that had nothing to do with him personally, and everything to do with her own escape from a cosmic order she'd apparently decided, long before the player ever meets her, was no longer worth being part of. One reading of Ranni treats her as the closest thing the story has to a genuinely calculating political actor, someone who identified the rules of the system she was born into, understood precisely which levers needed to be pulled to break free of it, and pulled them without much apparent hesitation about the cost to people who loved her or depended on her. Under this reading, Godwin's death is almost incidental to Ranni, a necessary casualty rather than a tragedy she carries any particular weight over. And her calm, distant demeanor throughout the game reflects someone who made her peace with that cost a long time before the story catches up to her. A more sympathetic reading points to details suggesting Ranni's detachment is closer to a defense mechanism than genuine indifference, that a person who orchestrated her own family member's death as a necessary step toward a larger goal might present as cold specifically because the alternative, actually sitting with what that decision cost, would make completing the plan impossible. Under this version, Ranni's entire affect, distant, patient, playing what appears to be an extraordinarily long game with total emotional control, is itself evidence of enormous suppressed weight rather than an absence of weight altogether. She isn't cold because she doesn't feel it. She's cold because feeling it while the plan is still incomplete isn't something she can afford. Neither reading is confirmed by anything approaching direct textual evidence, and it's worth being honest that this is exactly the kind of character analysis that risks projecting more psychological depth onto a video game character than the writing necessarily supports. But Ranni's questline does reward this kind of scrutiny more than most, precisely because so much of what she's doing is deliberately obscured from the player until very late, forcing you to reconstruct her motivations retroactively, the same way you reconstruct the emotional weight of the fire giant's death or the undying soldier's condition after the fact, once enough pieces are finally in front of you to assemble into a coherent picture. What's less ambiguous is the goal itself, and what it implies about the Golden Order as a cosmic structure. Ranni doesn't want to reform the Golden Order or replace Marika at its head, the way most of the other demigods vying for the Elden Ring during the War of the Shattering seem to want. She wants out entirely, a complete severance from the mechanism of death and rebirth and Erdtree's sanctioned fate that governs everyone else in this world, replaced with something she calls the Age of Stars, defined more by absence, cold, distance, and quiet than by any positive vision the game ever fully articulates. Ranni's ending isn't a new order taking over from the old one. It's closer to an exit from the concept of order altogether, at least the kind of order that requires an Erdtree and a greater will pulling strings from somewhere outside the world entirely. That phrase, somewhere outside the world entirely, brings us to the strand of lore that ties everything we've discussed so far into a single unresolved question. The identity and nature of the greater will itself, the entity whose will the entire Golden Order claims to be an expression of, and whose voice has apparently gone silent at some point before the game's events begin, for reasons the story never states outright and may not even fully know itself. The two fingers, the withered grotesque appendages found deep beneath the round table hold, are the closest thing the player ever gets to a direct interface with the greater will, and even that interface is heavily mediated, communicated through the finger reader Enya and through visions rather than anything resembling direct speech. The greater will itself never appears. It never speaks in any form the player can parse as language. What we know of its intentions, we know entirely through the actions of its followers and through what Marika built in its name, which means every claim anyone makes about what the greater will actually wants is, at bottom, secondhand at best. That's an unusual choice for a game to make about the entity nominally responsible for the entire cosmological structure everyone in the story orients around. Most fantasy settings that build a religion around a distant, unseen god at least give you a prophet with a clear message, a scripture the player can read and evaluate. Elden Ring gives you Marika's Golden Order, presented as the greater will's expression in the world, and then slowly, patiently over the course of the entire game, undermines your confidence that this expression bears any reliable resemblance to whatever the greater will actually wants, assuming it wants anything at all in a way comprehensible to human or demigod minds. The clearest piece of evidence for this erosion of trust comes from what happened to Godwyn and to the concept of death itself. At some point before the game begins, the Rune of Death, held by the fingers themselves, as their contribution to the world's original order, either malfunctioned, was deliberately altered, or was removed from proper function entirely, resulting in the broken state of death we discussed earlier in relation to the Undying Soldiers. Godwyn's actual death, engineered by Ranni's plan and Malekith's blade, becomes the catalyst that finally breaks this already fragile system completely. But the system was fragile long before Ranni acted, which raises the question of whether the Greater Will's order was ever as stable as the Golden Order's propaganda insisted it was. One theory, popular enough among lore researchers to function as something close to a working consensus, holds that the Greater Will effectively abandoned or lost interest in the Lands Between at some point significantly before the game's events, its silence not a temporary absence, but something closer to a permanent withdrawal, leaving the entire Golden Order operating on inertia and inherited authority rather than any ongoing active guidance. Under this reading, everything Marika built, everything the demigods fought over, every rule the player is expected to respect throughout the story, was already running on fumes long before Godwyn's death, a system maintaining the appearance of divine sanction, while the actual divinity backing that sanction had quietly stopped paying attention. If that's true, it recontextualizes nearly everything else in this script. The Undying Soldiers aren't simply victims of a broken Rune of Death. They're victims of an entire cosmic bureaucracy that stopped being staffed by anyone actually watching, left to run on autopilot with nobody left to notice when the mechanism started producing horrors nobody intended. The Eternal City beneath Noxtella, mourning a god who died before the current order even took shape, becomes less an isolated tragedy and more an early instance of a pattern that would eventually happen to the entire Lands Between under Marika's own order, which would itself eventually be left mourning an absent authority, the same way Noxtella mourns its own lost moon deity. A competing reading resists the idea that the Greater Will abandoned anything, arguing instead that its apparent silence is a matter of scale and communication rather than absence, that an entity operating on whatever cosmic register the Greater Will occupies might simply not communicate in ways legible to beings living inside the world it's shepherding. The same way a person wouldn't expect direct verbal communication from, to borrow an analogy some lore researchers have used, the process of erosion shaping a canyon. Under this reading, the Greater Will hasn't gone anywhere. It's still operating exactly as it always has. The silence players perceive is simply the natural experience of being a small part of a much larger process that was never going to explain itself to its constituent pieces in the first place. Both readings leave uncomfortable territory for Marika specifically, because if the first reading is true, she built and maintained an entire civilization's worth of religious and political authority on the back of a mandate that had quietly expired, whether she knew it or not. And if the second reading is true, she may have simply been wrong, or convenient, in her interpretation of what the Greater Will actually wanted, imposing an order shaped as much by her own judgment as by any genuine divine instruction, dressed up in the language of sanctioned authority to make it more palatable to the demigods and citizens who had to live under it. This is where the Frenzied Flame becomes relevant, because it represents, as far as the game's cosmology goes, the closest thing to a direct rival cosmic force actively competing for influence over the Lands Between, rather than simply an absent authority whose silence has to be interpreted secondhand. The three fingers, distinct from the two fingers who serve the Greater Will, offer an entirely different outcome, the Flame of Frenzy, an ending that involves burning away everything, all order, all structure, all individuated selfhood, collapsing every distinction the Golden Order relies on into a single undifferentiated blaze. Where Ranni's path is an exit into cold, distant, quiet order, the Frenzied Flame path is an exit into total, screaming, unity through annihilation. It's worth asking why the three fingers exist at all, tucked away in the same chamber beneath the capital, close enough to the two fingers that the game seems to be suggesting some relationship or rivalry between them, without ever spelling out what that relationship actually is. One reading treats the three fingers as a kind of shadow or antithesis specifically generated by the Golden Order's own excesses, an outer god that gains strength, precisely because the world it's opposing has become so rigidly structured, so obsessed with hierarchy and tarnished status and demigod bloodlines, that something has to exist as the pressure valve, the force pulling toward total dissolution, because the alternative has become so oppressively particular and stratified. Under that reading, the frenzied flame isn't an external threat invading the lands between from somewhere else. It's closer to a symptom the Golden Order itself produced, the same way a body under enough stress in one direction eventually produces a countervailing reaction in the other. The madness of the frenzied flame and the rigid order of the Erd Tree aren't opposites so much as two expressions of the same underlying instability. An entire cosmic and political system that has been running too long without the actual guiding authority it claims to represent, producing increasingly extreme reactions at both ends as a result. A more literal reading simply treats the Three Fingers as one outer god among several competing for influence over the lands between. No more a symptom of the Golden Order specifically than the moon deity worshipped in the Eternal City was a symptom of anything, just another entity with its own agenda, its own worshippers, and its own vision for what the world should become, existing in genuine competition with the greater will rather than as some kind of psychological byproduct of it. This reading keeps the cosmology cleaner, more like a marketplace of competing gods, and less like a single traumatized system generating its own opposition from internal pressure. We don't get to resolve which of these is correct, and it's entirely possible the writers themselves didn't settle on a single definitive answer, leaving the ambiguity intact by design, rather than by oversight. What we can say is that both the Age of Stars and the Flame of Frenzy represent, in their own very different ways, an exhaustion with the specific cosmic arrangement Marika built, a shared verdict from two very different corners of the story that whatever the Golden Order was supposed to be providing, it had stopped providing it convincingly enough that both a witch obsessed with distant cold. Order and a chorus of madness-worshipping outcasts independently concluded the entire structure needed to end rather than simply be reformed. Which finally brings us back to Marika herself, and to the promise we made near the start of this script, because everything we've discussed so far, the demigods who merge rather than control, the undying soldiers trapped by a broken rune of death, the buried civilization mourning a silence nobody explained, the last fire giant holding a position that was already ending before the player arrived, Ronnie's cold, calculated exit, and the frenzied flame screaming one. All of it eventually funnels back toward one figure standing at the absolute center of the Lands Between's entire cosmic architecture, and the strangest, most unsettling instance of the merger pattern in the entire game. Radagon of the Golden Order and Marika the Eternal are, as most players eventually learn either through the story itself or through spoilers absorbed well before they ever reach the capital, the same being, fused together in a way the game never fully explains through dialogue. Left instead for players to piece together through item descriptions, environmental storytelling, and the final boss encounter, where the two identities are shown occupying, impossibly the same body at different points during a single fight. This isn't a twist delivered for shock value alone. It's the culmination of the exact pattern this entire script opened with, back at Volcano Manor. Before we'd even reached the Fell Twins, the demigods who choose to merge with the source of their power rather than simply hold it at a distance. Except here the merger isn't between a person and a substance, the way Millennium merged with Scarlet Rot, or between a person and another person's flesh, the way Moog bound himself to Maquella. Here the merger is between two entire identities, two separate names, two separate sets of memories and relationships and apparent personalities, occupying a single physical form, and the game gives us almost no clean account of how or why this happened, or which one, if either, should be considered the original. What we do know comes in fragments. Marika is described as the being who shattered the Elden Ring, setting off the war that consumes the entire game's plot, and who has been missing or silenced since that shattering, her disappearance treated by nearly every character in the story as a foundational mystery nobody has managed to solve. Radagon, meanwhile, appears throughout item descriptions and background lore as a warrior who married into Karia's royal line, then abandoned that marriage to instead marry Marika herself, an act treated by nearly every character who mentions it as inexplicable. A betrayal with no clearly stated motive, made stranger by the fact that Radagon and Marika are, it turns out, the same person. Meaning Radagon effectively left one marriage to enter what amounts to a second marriage with himself, under a different name and a different identity. Sit with that for a moment, because it's stranger than it first appears even once you know the twist. If Radagon and Marika are one being splitting or duplicating into two separate identities, then the marriage between them isn't simply a strange political alliance or a betrayal of Queen Rinola. It's something closer to a single consciousness attempting to relate to itself as though it were two separate people, formalizing that internal division through an external, socially recognized bond, as though the fracture inside this being was severe enough that the only way to manage it was to give each half a name, a body, and a marriage certificate binding them together as though they'd always been separate to begin with. One reading, and probably the most widely cited among lore researchers who've spent serious time on this specific question, holds that Marika and Radagon represent a single soul split by design, deliberately fractured into a golden order-aligned aspect, Marika, and a more grounded, physically active aspect, Radagon, precisely because whatever task Marika was assigned by the Greater Will required capabilities that no single unified identity could hold at once. Under this reading, the split isn't a malfunction. It's closer to a tool, a way of allowing one being to simultaneously occupy the distant, symbolic, quasi-divine rule of an Erdtree-aligned Elden Lord while also remaining active and embodied enough to fight in wars, father children, and physically intervene in worldly events the purely golden aspect couldn't touch directly. If that's the correct reading, it means the demigods' pattern of merging with their power, the pattern that opened this entire script, isn't simply something the children inherited independently from their mother's example. It's something considerably more direct than inheritance. It's literally the mechanism their mother's own existence was built on from the very beginning, meaning Millennia's choice to become one with Scarlet Rot and Mohg's choice to bind himself to Maquella's flesh aren't imitations of a principle they observed. They're expressions of a structural rule baked into their own bloodline at its absolute point of origin, something closer to genetic inheritance than learned behavior, a family trait so fundamental it shaped the very first member of the family before any child of that family was ever born. A second reading treats the Radagon and Marika split less as an intentional tool and more as evidence of trauma or cost, the scar left behind by whatever process elevated Marika to her current status in the first place, rather than a deliberate design choice she or the Greater Will made with full control over the outcome. Under this version, becoming an Empyrean, becoming the vessel through which the Greater Will's order operates in the physical world, isn't something a single stable identity can survive intact. It fractures you, necessarily and irreversibly, the same way carrying the specific power Millennia carries seems to have required her to become something other than fully herself in order to hold it. The split between Radagon and Marika, on this reading, isn't a clever solution to a practical problem. It's the wound the position leaves behind, dressed up afterward in the language of marriage and separate identity, because that was the only framework available for describing something that doesn't have a clean human precedent. This second reading gains some support from how genuinely lost Radagon seems within the game's own text, particularly in how his abandonment of Rennala is framed by other characters, not as a calculated strategic decision, but as something closer to compulsion, an act nobody, including apparently Radagon himself, can fully account for in rational terms. If the split were a controlled, intentional tool, you might expect Radagon's actions to read as purposeful even when they're painful to others. Instead, multiple characters across the story describe his choices as bewildering, uncharacteristic, a betrayal that doesn't seem to serve anyone's interests cleanly, including his own. That confusion, embedded directly in how the story's other characters talk about him, fits more naturally with a being who is fractured by forces beyond his control than a being executing a plan. There's a further wrinkle worth raising here, because the identity of exactly who or what caused this fracture in the first place remains almost entirely unaddressed by the game's text. If Marika was elevated to Empyrean status by the Greater Will specifically in order to establish the Golden Order, and if that elevation is what produced the Radagon split as either tool or wound, then the entity ultimately responsible for the strangest, most foundational instance of the merger pattern in the entire game is the same distant, silent Greater Will we spent the last section discussing, an entity whose motives remain, even at this late stage, almost entirely unknowable to the player, mediated through item descriptions and secondhand testimony, rather than anything resembling direct confirmation. It's worth pausing here to notice how thoroughly this collapses the distance between every thread we've followed so far. The Undying Soldiers exist because a specific rune, held by the fingers who serve the Greater Will, stopped functioning properly. The Eternal City beneath Noxtella mourns a silence from an entity that may have simply moved on. The same kind of silence the Greater Will itself now maintains toward everyone still living under Marika's order. The Fire Giants maintained a weapon against that same order for generations after anyone remained who could authorize its use. Ranni's entire plan is built around escaping the consequences of what happened to Marika and Radagon, engineering an exit from a system whose foundational fracture she may understand better than almost anyone else in the story, precisely because she is, after all, one of its direct products. And the demigod's shared instinct to merge with their power rather than control it, the instinct we opened this entire script with at Volcano Manor, turns out not to be a coincidence repeated across multiple unrelated children. It's a family trait, passed down from a mother whose own identity was split, merged, and reassembled at some point before any of her children were born, in a process nobody in the story, possibly including Marika herself, seems fully able to explain. Every merger we've discussed, Millennia in her rot, Mohg in Miquella's flesh, Rykard swallowing Godfrey's dragon form ancestor entirely, all of it echoes downward from the exact same source. A mother who apparently taught her children, whether deliberately or simply by existing as their example, that power in this world was never meant to be held. It was meant to be become. That's about as close to a unifying theory as this particular thread of Elden Ring's lore gets, and it's still, even after everything we've laid out, entirely unconfirmed by anything resembling direct textual evidence. From Software never has a character stand up and say this plainly. The entire structure has to be assembled by players willing to sit with item descriptions long enough, compare enough disparate details across dozens of hours of gameplay, and accept that the reward for doing so isn't a clean answer so much as a slightly less foggy version of the same fundamental uncertainty the game opened with. Let's step back from Marika and Radagon for a moment and head somewhere considerably smaller in scale, because there's a single, easily missed NPC interaction near the Roundtable Hold that puts a strange, quiet, almost domestic spin on everything we've just spent so long unpacking about gods, fractures, and inherited patterns of power. The interaction belongs to Hyetta, a blind maiden found wandering the roads of Liurnia long before most players ever bring her back to the Roundtable Hold. Someone easy to mistake for a minor errand-giving NPC rather than a character carrying one of the more quietly devastating arcs in the entire game. Hyetta believes she's searching for a purpose tied to the frenzied flame, convinced across most of her questline that she's meant to become a vessel for it, meant to burn, meant to fulfill something she frames as destiny, rather than choice. What makes Hyetta's arc land differently than most of the game's cosmic tragedies is how small and personal its final beats are compared to everything surrounding it. Her story doesn't end with a boss fight or a world-altering revelation. It ends, for most players who follow it faithfully, with her quietly asking the player for an act of mercy, her belief in her own destiny having curdled by that point into something closer to suffering she no longer wants to carry, and the game offering the player almost no comfortable way to resolve that request. You can end her story here, and it will feel less like defeating an enemy and more like the same uncomfortable territory the Undying Soldiers put us in earlier, an act that might be kindness dressed as violence, or violence dressed as kindness, with the game refusing to clarify which. Hyetta's belief that she was meant to serve the frenzied flame. And the fact that this belief turns out to be at least partially mistaken or exploited rather than a genuine calling connects her story quietly to everything we just discussed about the Three Fingers and the Golden Order's own internal fractures. She isn't a demigod. She isn't tied to any bloodline the story treats as cosmically significant. She's an ordinary person who got caught in the gravitational pull of a much larger cosmic conflict, mistook that pull for meaning, and ended up paying a price entirely disproportionate to whatever role she actually played in the larger story. If the Golden Order's fracture produces horrors at the scale of Millennia's rot and Mohg's captivity of Miquella, it also apparently produces smaller, quieter horrors like Hyetta's, victims who never get a boss theme or a cutscene, just a single quiet conversation easy to miss entirely if you don't happen to bring the right item to the right person at the right time. A similarly overlooked thread involves the merchant known simply as D, Hunter of the Dead, found early in the game selling items near the first major church most players encounter, and his twin brother Fia, the deathbed companion, found much later curled up with a cluster of what appear to be corpses inside the Roundtable Hold itself. The two brothers, we eventually learn through scattered dialogue and item descriptions, were separated as children specifically because they were twins, and twins in this world's culture are treated as omens requiring separation. One to be raised in isolation, the other kept close, a cultural practice the game never fully justifies but treats as an accepted, unquestioned norm within its setting. D dies partway through the game's runtime, killed by his own brother under circumstances the story leaves frustratingly vague, and Fia's reaction to this, once the player brings her the news, is muted almost to the point of dissonance. a controlled grief that reads as either genuine restraint or as something closer to the same detachment we discussed earlier regarding Ronnie. Someone whose emotional responses have been shaped by a life spent as an instrument of forces larger than personal relationships, forced from childhood to treat her own brother as something closer to a cosmic threat requiring management, rather than simply a sibling she was allowed to love without complication. This detail about twins being separated at birth as a cultural or religious practice connects, in a way the game never states outright, but which several lore researchers have pointed toward, back to the Fell twins discussed earlier in this script, and to Morgott and Moog themselves, who according to some interpretations of their backstory were also separated as children specifically because of their twin status, one kept in Lindell, one sent away, before eventually reuniting as adults under circumstances that pulled them toward radically different fates, one becoming the tortured, self-loathing guardian of a capital that never accepted him, the other becoming a blood-soaked lord ruling from the depths beneath that same capital. If twin separation really is a consistent cultural practice across the lands between, applied to demigods and ordinary people alike, it suggests something uncomfortable about how deeply this world's institutions are organized around managing perceived cosmic risk at the expense of ordinary human bonds, treating the accident of being born alongside a sibling as something dangerous enough to justify permanently severing that relationship before either child is old enough to have any say in the matter. Dianfia's story, small and easy to miss as it is, becomes a kind of miniature version of the exact same institutional cruelty that shaped Morgo and Moog's much larger, much more consequential estrangement, the same pattern repeating at drastically different scales. From demigods who eventually go to war against each other to two low-key NPCs whose entire tragedy fits into a handful of item descriptions most players never read closely enough to piece together. It's worth asking, and the game never answers this directly, whether the practice of separating twins reflects some genuine demonstrated danger particular to twins in this cosmology, connected perhaps to the same rules governing power and merger we've spent this entire script tracing, or whether it's simply inherited superstition, cruelty justified after the fact by claiming cosmic necessity, no different in kind from any real-world tradition that treats an unusual birth circumstance as an omen requiring drastic intervention. Marika's own children who were twins ended up divided by conflict and geography, regardless of whatever initial separation practice may or may not have applied to them specifically, which could be read as confirmation that the practice reflects a genuine pattern worth fearing, or simply as coincidence. Two siblings who are always going to end up on opposite sides of a war this brutal regardless of how their childhood was structured. Let's turn now toward a different kind of mystery entirely, one that has almost nothing to do with bloodlines or cosmic order and everything to do with a single strange item players can find relatively early in the game, an item whose implications, once you actually sit with them, quietly undermine a huge portion of what the player has been told to assume about their own role in this entire story. The item is small, easy to walk past, a memento left behind by a fellow tarnished you can find already dead in the world, one of many identical corpses scattered across the lands between, wearing the exact same starting equipment the player themselves begins the game holding. At first glance, this reads as simple environmental flavor, evidence that other adventurers attempted this same journey and failed before you arrived. Sit with it a little longer though, and a much stranger implication starts to surface, because those corpses aren't just other adventurers. Multiple pieces of evidence throughout the game suggest they are, in a very direct sense, other versions of exactly what the player is. The player character is a tarnished, one of countless exiles who lost their status as an Empyrean-touched candidate for godhood, banished across the sea from the lands between, long before the game begins, only called back once Marika shatters the Elden Ring, and the grace that once excluded them from returning finally starts guiding Tarnished back home. Crucially, the player is never presented as a unique Tarnished, singled out by any special quality that separates them from the thousands of others who received the same call and made the same journey back across the sea in search of the same prize. This means every other corpse you find wearing the same starting gear, holding the same starting spells, following the same starting path most new players instinctively follow, simply because the game's layout nudges everyone in the same direction early on, isn't simply an unrelated NPC who happened to die nearby. It's plausibly a different attempt at the exact same story you're currently playing. Someone who received the same call, walked the same road, and failed somewhere along the way. For reasons the game never specifies beyond the simple fact that they aren't the ones standing here reading their memento now. If that's the correct reading, and it's supported strongly enough by the game's own framing devices that it's become close to consensus among lore researchers, then Elden Ring is quietly telling you, through nothing but corpse placement and shared equipment, that your playthrough isn't special in any way the world itself would recognize. You are one tarnished among an uncountable number who received an identical invitation and walked an identical road, and the only thing distinguishing your specific attempt from all the failed ones scattered across the map is that you haven't failed yet. The story you're experiencing as uniquely yours, the one the marketing and the box art and the entire framing of the game encourages you to feel personally invested in, may be nothing more than the version of this story that happened not to end early, this particular time. This connects in an unexpectedly direct way to everything discussed earlier about the undying soldiers and their broken relationship with death. If countless other tarnished made this exact journey before you and failed somewhere along the way, what actually happened to them? Some presumably died in ways that ended them completely. But given how thoroughly this world's relationship with death has been destabilized by the missing rune of death, it's entirely possible, and again never confirmed outright, that some of those failed tarnished didn't simply cease to exist upon dying. Some of them may still be out there, wandering, fighting, following orders or instincts that no longer serve any coherent purpose. Indistinguishable in practice from the undying soldiers discussed several threads ago, except that these particular undying soldiers happen to be built from the exact same narrative template the player themselves currently occupies. Under this reading, killing an undying soldier somewhere out in the lands between and killing a fellow tarnished you occasionally encounter as an invader or a summoned phantom during co-op play, aren't as different as the game's separate mechanical categories for these encounters might suggest. Both could represent versions of the same basic figure, someone who received the call, made the journey, and ended up trapped in a broken cycle of undeath rather than either succeeding or simply ending. The only real distinction between them being how far into their own version of this story they managed to get before things went wrong. There's a further layer worth considering here involving the concept of grace itself, the golden guiding light that leads the player from location to location throughout the game, presented mechanically as a helpful navigational tool, but treated within the story's own logic as a genuinely significant cosmic phenomenon, evidence that the Golden Order or the greater will behind it has, specifically, selected the player as worthy of guidance toward the Elden Ring. If countless other tarnished received this same call and this same guiding grace, and the vast majority of them failed anyway, then grace itself starts to look less like a mark of special favor, and more like something closer to a lottery ticket handed out indiscriminately to an enormous pool of candidates, with the actual outcome determined by factors that have nothing to do with any inherent worthiness grace was supposed to signal in the first place. That's a genuinely uncomfortable thought to sit with if you've spent dozens of hours experiencing this story as though your specific tarnished's success reflects something meaningful about them personally, some quality that distinguishes them from the countless failed attempts scattered as corpses across every region of the map. The game never explicitly confirms this deflationary reading, and it would be reasonable to resist it on the grounds that stories generally do want their protagonists to matter in some way beyond sheer statistical survival. But Elden Ring's environmental storytelling keeps returning to this same uncomfortable ambiguity, refusing to clearly state that the player's success stems from anything beyond having simply not failed yet, the same way it refuses to clearly state whether killing an undying soldier is mercy or slaughter, the same way it refuses to confirm whether the Fell twins are literally Morgott and Mohg or simply two more anonymous omens sharing their condition. A more generous reading of the player's role points to the ending choices available at the very end of the game, the sheer range of dramatically different outcomes the Tarnish can bring about, from becoming a new Elden Lord under a restored Golden Order to joining Ranni's Age of Stars, to embracing the frenzied flame and burning everything down, to several other endings besides, as evidence that the player character does eventually do something none of the failed Tarnish scattered across the map managed to do, actually reach the Erd Tree and actually determine, through genuine choice, what comes next for this entire broken cosmic system. Under this reading, the player's specialness isn't inherent or predetermined. It's earned entirely through the act of persistence itself, and persistence in a world this actively hostile to survival might be exactly the quality worth treating as meaningful, regardless of whether grace initially selected the player for any deeper reason at all. Both readings can sit alongside each other without fully canceling one another out, which by this point in the script should feel like a familiar shape. The Lands Between rarely offers a single answer when two plausible ones can coexist, and whether that reflects careful, deliberate ambiguity or simply a story built from enough disconnected fragments that multiple coherent readings become possible almost by accident, is itself one more version of the exact same unresolved question this script keeps circling back toward, again and again, without ever quite landing anywhere final. Let's turn next toward the game's ending choices themselves, and a detail buried in one of the least commonly chosen endings that quietly reframes almost everything the player has been fighting for across the entire game's runtime. The ending in question belongs to the Lord of Frenzied Flame path, one of the least chosen endings among casual players precisely because reaching it requires deliberately abandoning most of the game's other major questlines, accepting the Three Fingers offer relatively early, and locking yourself out of nearly every other narrative thread the game has to offer in the process. Most players who see this ending see it exactly once, out of curiosity, on a separate save file specifically built to avoid losing progress on paths they actually want to pursue, which means the actual content of what happens is far less commonly discussed than it probably deserves to be. What the ending shows, without spoiling every specific visual detail, is the Tarnished consumed entirely by the flame, becoming something less like a new ruler of a reordered world, and more like a living conduit for total, indiscriminate destruction. The game's final cutscene depicting fire spreading outward without any clear endpoint, without any suggestion of a new order rising from the ashes, the way the game's other endings at least gesture toward. Where becoming Elden Lord under a restored Golden Order, or joining Rennie's Age of Stars both present, however ambiguously, some vision of what comes next, the Frenzied Flame ending offers nothing except the flame itself, continuing, presumably until there's nothing left to burn. This connects directly back to the theory discussed earlier that the Frenzied Flame functions as a kind of pressure release valve, produced by the Golden Order's own excesses, an outer god that exists specifically because the alternative to total structure eventually has to be total dissolution, once the structure becomes rigid enough. If that reading holds, the Frenzied Flame ending isn't really a new path forward for the lands between at all. It's the absence of a path, the logical terminus of a system that has been accumulating pressure since long before the game's events, finally allowed to release completely, with the player's own Tarnished serving as nothing more than the specific vessel who happened to be standing in the right place when that release finally occurred. It's worth noting how uncomfortable this makes the player's own agency across the entire ending, because unlike the Elden Lord ending or Ranni's Age of Stars, both of which at least frame the Tarnished as an active architect of what comes next, the Frenzied Flame ending increasingly strips away any sense that the player is choosing an outcome at all, replacing it instead with the sense of the player being consumed by something that was always going to happen eventually, with or without their specific intervention. Where the other endings ask what kind of world you want to build, this ending asks something closer to whether you're willing to stop being a person distinct from the fire altogether, returning us one final time to the exact merger pattern this entire script opened with at Volcano Manor. Except here, the merger isn't between a demigod and their signature power. It's between the player's own character and the single most totalizing force available anywhere in the game's cosmology. A markedly different ending, added considerably later than the base game's original set, involves Miquella, the demigod whose captivity by Mohg opened this entire script's second thread, and whose own arc, once fully explored, turns out to complicate nearly everything the earlier portions of the game imply about him. Miquella is introduced primarily through absence, a demigod defined by his missing status, kept as Mohg's captive in the depths beneath Lindell. Discussed by other characters in tones that suggest near-universal reverence, someone whose compassion and gentleness are held up repeatedly as the one unambiguously good quality among Mareka's entire fractured warring family of children. That reputation, once the player actually gets deep enough into content specifically built around Miquella, turns out to rest on considerably more complicated ground than the earlier portions of the story suggest. Miquella's compassion, it becomes clear through numerous details scattered across this later content, isn't presented as simple, uncomplicated kindness, so much as a kind of overwhelming, almost coercive force in its own right, capable of reshaping the will and loyalty of everyone around him, whether they consent to that reshaping or not. Characters devoted to Miquella across the game don't always read as freely choosing that devotion. Some of them read as having had the capacity to choose anything else quietly removed from them entirely, replaced with a devotion so total it no longer resembles a choice in any meaningful sense. This reframes Mohg's captivity of Miquella, the thread we opened this entire script with, in a genuinely uncomfortable new light. If Mequella's compassion functions less like an unambiguous virtue and more like a kind of gravitational force capable of consuming the independent will of everyone who comes near it, then Mohg's decision to bind himself in his own blood to Mequella's flesh wasn't simply an act of possessive cruelty performed against an innocent, wholly sympathetic victim. It may have been Mohg attempting to survive proximity to something genuinely dangerous, in his own twisted, violent, entirely unjustifiable way, treating captivity and physical binding as a defense against being consumed by Mequella's influence the same way everyone else eventually was, rather than treating Mequella purely as a prize to be seized. That reading doesn't excuse Mohg. Nothing in the game's later content suggests players are meant to view what he did as justified or even particularly sympathetic, but it does complicate the clean victim and villain framing the earlier portions of the story encourage, suggesting instead that both figures involved in this specific merger were responding in their own deeply damaged ways to a version of the exact same underlying rule this entire script has been tracing from the very beginning. Power in the lands between cannot simply be held at a comfortable distance. Eventually it consumes the distance itself, whether that power belongs to a demigod's signature affliction, an entire family's fractured founding identity, or it now appears. One demigod's seemingly uncomplicated capacity for compassion turns so absolute it stops leaving room for anyone nearby to remain fully themselves. Let's close out this particular stretch of the script by returning briefly to where we started, the Fell twins standing guard on their bridge in East Altus, because there's one final piece of evidence relevant to their identity that we deliberately held back earlier, evidence that doesn't resolve the mystery so much as deepen it considerably.